Hello, comrades. Today I'm going to be doing a reading of Albert Einstein's Why Socialism. It can be found on monthlyreview.org. This is his essay defending socialism and criticizing capitalism. And anyway, let's just begin. Is it advisable for one who is not an expert on economic and social issues to express views on the subject of socialism? I believe, for a number of reasons, that it is. Let us first consider the question from the point of view of scientific knowledge. It might appear that there are no essential methodological differences between astronomy and economics. Scientists in both fields attempt to discover laws of general acceptability for a circumscribed group of phenomena in order to make interconnection in these phenomena as clearly understandable as possible. But, in reality, such methodological differences do exist. The discovery of general laws in the fields of economics is made difficult by the circumstance that observed economic phenomena are often affected by many factors which are very hard to evaluate separately. In addition, the experience which has accumulated since the beginning of the so-called civilized period of humanity has, as is well known, been largely influenced and limited by causes which are by no means exclusively economic in nature. For example, most of the major states of history owed their existence to conquest. The conquering peoples established themselves legally and economically as a privileged class of the conquered country. They seized for themselves a monopoly of the land ownership and appointed a priesthood among their own ranks. The priests in control of education made the class division of society into permanent institution and created a system of values by which people were thenceforth, to a large extent, unconsciously guided in their social behavior. But historic tradition is, so to speak, of yesterday. Nowhere have we really overcome what Thorstein Veblen called the predatory phase of human development. The observable economic facts belong to that phase, and even such laws as we can derive from them are not applicable to other phases. Since the real purpose of socialism is precisely to overcome and advance beyond the predatory phase of human development, economic science, in its present state, can now throw a little light on the socialist society of the future. Second, socialism is directed towards a social, ethical end. Science, however, cannot create ends, and even less instill them in human beings. Science at most can supply the means by which we attain certain ends, but the ends themselves are conceived by personalities with lofty ethical ideals, and if these ends are not stillborn, but vital and vigorous, are adopted and carried forward by those many human beings who, half-consciously, determine the slow evolution of society. For these reasons, we should be on our guard not to overestimate science and scientific methods when it is a question of human problems, and we should not assume that experts are the only ones who have the right to express themselves on questions affecting the organization of society. Innumerable voices have been asserting for some time now that human society is passing through a crisis, that its stability has been gravely shattered. It is characteristic of such a situation that individuals feel indifferent or even hostile towards the group, small or large, to which they belong. In order to illustrate my meaning, let me record here a personal experience I recently discussed with an intelligent and well-disposed man: the threat of another war, which, in my opinion, would seriously endanger the existence of mankind. And I remarked that only a supranational organization would offer protection from that disaster. Thereupon my visitor, very calmly and coolly, said to me, "Why are you so deeply opposed to the disappearance of the human race?" I am sure that as little as a century ago, no one would have so lightly made a statement of this kind. It is a statement of a man who has striven in vain to attain an equilibrium within himself and has more or less lost hope of succeeding. It is the expression of a painful solitude and isolation from which so many people are suffering in these days. What is the cause? Is there a way out? It is easy to raise such questions, but difficult to answer them with any degree of assurance. I must try, however, as best I can, although I am very conscious of the fact that our feelings and strivings are often contradictory and obscure, and that they cannot be expressed in easy, simple formulas. Man is, at one and the same time, a solitary being and a social being. As a solitary being, he attempts to protect his own existence and that of those who are closest to him, to satisfy his personal desires, and to develop his innate abilities. As a social being, he seeks to gain recognition and affection of his fellow human beings, to share in their pleasures, to comfort them in their sorrows, and to improve their conditions of life. Only the existence of these varied, frequently conflicting strivings accounts for the special character of man and their specific combination determines the extent to which an individual can achieve an inner equilibrium and can contribute to the well-being of society. It is quite possible that the relative strength of these two drives, in the main fixed by inheritance, but the personality that finally emerges is largely formed by the environment in which man happens to find himself during his development, by the structure of society in which he grows up, by the tradition of that society, and by its appraisal of particular types of behavior. The abstract concept of society means to the individual human being the sum total of his direct and indirect relatives, to his contemporaries, and to all the people of earlier generations. The individual is able to think, feel, strive, and work by himself. But he depends so much upon society in his physical, intellectual, and emotional existence that it is impossible to think of him or to understand him outside the framework of society. It is society which provides man with food, clothing, a home, the tools of work, language, the forms of thought, and most of the content of the thought. His life is made possible through the labor and the accomplishments of many millions, past and present, who are all hidden behind the small word society. It is evident, therefore, that the dependence of the individual upon society is a fact of nature which cannot be abolished, just as in the case of ants and bees. However, while the whole life process of ants and bees is fixed down to the smallest detail by rigid hereditary instincts, the social pattern of interrelationships of human beings are very variable and susceptible to change. Memory, the capacity to make new combinations, the gift of oral communication have made possible developments among human beings which are not dictated by biological necessities. Such developments manifest themselves in traditions, institutions, and organizations, in literature, in science, and engineering accomplishments, in works of art. This explains how it happens that, in a certain sense, man can influence his life through his own conduct, and that, in this process, conscious thinking and wanting can play a part. Man acquires at birth through heredity a biological constitution which we must consider fixed and unalterable, including the natural urges which are characteristic of the human species. In addition, during his lifetime, he acquires a cultural constitution which he adopts from society through communication and through many other types of influences. It is this cultural constitution which, with the passage of time, is subject to change, and which determines to a very large extent the relationship between the individual and society. Modern anthropology has taught us, through comparative investigation of so-called primitive cultures, that the social behavior of human beings may differ greatly, depending on prevailing cultural patterns and the types of organizations which predominate in society. It is on this that those who are striving to improve the lot of man may ground their hopes. Human beings are not condemned because of their biological constitution to annihilate each other or be at the mercy of cruel, self-inflicted fate. If we ask ourselves how the structure of society and the cultural attitude of man should be changed in order to make human life as satisfying as possible, we should constantly be conscious of the fact that there are certain conditions which we are unable to modify. As mentioned before, the biological nature of man is, for all practical purposes, not subject to change. Furthermore, technological and demographic developments of the last few centuries have created conditions which are here to stay in relatively densely settled populations, where the goods which are indispensable to their continued existence, an extreme division of labor, and a highly centralized productive apparatus are absolutely necessary. The time which, looking back, seems so idyllic is gone forever when individuals or relatively small groups of people could be completely self-sufficient. It is only a slight exaggeration to say that mankind constitutes even now a planetary community of production and consumption. I have now reached the point where I may indicate briefly what to me constitutes the essence of the crisis of our time. It concerns the relationship of the individual to society. The individual has become more conscious than ever of his dependence upon society, but he does not experience this dependence as a positive asset, as an organic tie, as a protective force, but rather as a threat to his natural rights, or even his economic existence. Moreover, his position in society is such that the egotistical drivers of his makeup are constantly being accentuated, while his social drives, which are by nature weaker, progressively deteriorate. All human beings, whatever their position in society, are suffering from this process of deterioration. Unknowingly prisoners of their own egotism, they feel insecure, lonely, and deprived of the naive, simple, and unsophisticated enjoyment of life. Man can find meaning in life, short and perilous as it is, only through devoting himself to society. The economic anarchy of capitalist society as it exists today is, in my opinion, the real source of the evil. We see before us a huge community of producers, the members of which are increasingly striving to deprive each other of the fruits of their collective labor, not by force, but, on the whole, in faithful compliance with legally established rules. In this respect, it is important to realize that the means of production, that is to say, the entire productive capacity that is needed for producing consumer goods as well as additional capital goods, may legally be, and for the most part are, the private property of individuals. For the sake of simplicity, in the discussion that follows, I shall call workers all those who do not share in the ownership of the means of production. Although this does not quite correspond to the customary use of the term, the owner of the means of production is in a position to purchase the labor power of the worker. By using the means of production, the worker produces new goods which become the property of the capitalist. The essential point about this process is the relation between what the worker produces and what he is paid, both measured in terms of real value, and so far as labor contract is free, what the worker receives is determined not by the real value of the goods he produces, but by his minimum needs and by the capitalist requirements for labor power in relation to the number of workers competing for jobs. It is important to understand that even in theory, the payment of the worker is not determined by the value of his product. Private capital tends to become concentrated in few hands, partly because of competition among the capitalists, and partly because technological development and the increasing division of labor encourage the formation of larger units of production at the expense of smaller ones. The result of these developments is an oligarchy of private capital and enormous power which cannot be effectively checked even by a democratically organized political society. This is true since the members of the legislative bodies are selected by political parties, largely financed or otherwise influenced by private capitalists, who, for all practical purposes, separate the electorate from the legislature. The consequence is that the representatives of the people do not, in fact, sufficiently protect the interests of the underprivileged sections of the population. Moreover, under existing conditions, private capitalists inevitably control, directly or indirectly, the main sources of information: press, radio, education. It is thus extremely difficult, and indeed in most cases quite impossible, for the individual citizen to come to objective conclusions and make intelligent use of his political rights. The situation prevailing in the economy based on private ownership of capital is thus characterized by two main principles. First, the means of production, capital, are privately owned, and the owners dispose of them as they see fit. Second, the labor contract is free. Of course, there's no such thing as pure capitalist society in this sense. In particular, it should be noted that the workers, through long and bitter political struggles, have succeeded in securing a somewhat improved form of the free labor contract for certain categories of workers. But, taken as a whole, the present-day economy does not differ from pure capitalism. Production is carried on for the profit, not for use. There's no provision that those able and willing to work will always be in a position to find employment. An army of unemployed almost always exists. The worker is constantly in fear of losing his job, since unemployment and poorly paid workers do not provide a profitable market. Production of consumers' goods is restricted, and the great hardship is a consequence. Technological progress frequently results in more unemployment rather than easing the burden of work for all. The profit motive, in conjunction with competition among capitalists, is responsible for an instability in the accumulation and utilization of capital, which leads to increasingly severe depressions. Unlimited competition leads to huge wastes of labor, and to that crippling of the social consciousness of individuals which I mentioned before. This crippling of individuals I consider the worst evil of capitalism. Our whole education system suffers from this evil. An exaggerated, competitive attitude is inculcated onto the students, who is trained to worship acquisitive success as a preparation for his future career. I am convinced that there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which will be oriented towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion. A planned economy which adjusts production to the needs of the community would distribute the work to be done among all those able to work and would guarantee a livelihood to every man, woman, and child. The education of the individual, in addition to promoting his own innate abilities, would attempt to develop in him a sense of responsibility for his fellow men and in place of the glorification of power and success in our present society. Nevertheless, it is necessary to remember that a planned economy is not yet socialism. Planned economy, as such, may be accompanied by the complete enslavement of the individual. The achievement of socialism requires the solution to some extremely difficult socio-political problems. How is it possible? In view of the far-reaching centralization of political and economic power, to prevent bureaucracy from becoming all-powerful and overweening. How can the rights of individuals be protected and therewith a democratic counterweight to the power of bureaucracy be assured? Clarity about the aims and problems of socialism is of greatest significance in our age of transition. Since, under present circumstances, free and unhindered discussion of these problems has come under a powerful taboo, I consider the foundation of this magazine to be an important public service. So that's the end of the audiobook. Now I will give some commentary. Sorry about that. I need to pull up the tab. Now, my commentary. What communism will look like is not fully clear, given that we have not seen communism exist, and Einstein sort of points out, like, we don't know exactly what socialism will be like. For instance, here when he says, economic science in its present state can throw little light on the socialist society of the future. We won't really know exactly what it looks like, but we can use what we know now to make educated guesses. And then the masses are the ones who make history, and they will be the ones to bring socialism. And experts aren't actually always the best to listen to. For instance, listening to like some neoliberal economist versus the people on the ground in the local communities being affected by economic policies, it would make more sense to listen to the people in the communities. Obviously, humankind are social beings, and material conditions determine, at least broadly, a person's personality, ideals, etc. And then humanity's strength is collaboration and community, and without society, we could not have made any number of cultural, philosophical, and technological gains. Conditions change over time. For instance, pre and post industrial society or pre and post internet society. So things that may have applied in the past might not apply as well or even at all today. And there are new issues that arise that we have to account for. Then when Einstein was talking about how certain people view society as like a negative and their dependence on it as like a negative, the example I think of for this is like right wing libertarians who view society and their dependence on it as negative. Then modern conditioning leads to negative effects, including isolation, in part a product of capitalist conditioning. Capitalism leads to monopoly and corruption of democracy, and if we want to build actual democracy, we need socialism. And yeah, obviously we can see in like modern day United States that, and across the world, that this is correct. Like a lot of what Einstein is saying here is still true to this very day, including the next point I have, which information is controlled by the capitalists. And yeah, this is still true today as well. Although with the internet, it's slightly more spread out, but still broadly it is controlled by the capitalists. And we are heading towards and then depressions are inherent to capitalism, as Einstein pointed out. And yeah, we're heading towards another, seemingly, I mean, we've continued to have depressions and recessions. So once again, Einstein is vindicated and proven correct. And capitalist conditioning does destroy individuals. It corrupts you. It makes you compete with your fellow humans as opposed to allying with them and working together to build something greater. It pits you against each other. And socialism fixes these problems, including if we have socialist education, which, yeah, I do believe in constructing a socialist society, you must have you must recreate the education system to promote more community oriented ideas, more critical thinking, as opposed to just churning out capitalist conditioned workers and whatnot. But yeah, that's most of my commentary. I didn't really have that much for this one. Anyway, yeah, thank you for watching. Solidarity.